Behind every story lies a truth waiting to be uncovered. Click subscribe and let's uncover it together. I used to think my life was untouchable, the kind of life you look at from the outside and think, he's made it, he's safe, nothing could ever go wrong for him. My name isn't important. What matters is that just a year ago, I had everything that people spend their whole lives chasing. A house in the suburbs, 2 cars parked in the driveway, a wife who had once looked at me with admiration, and kids who ran to greet me every time I came home from work. I had a career too, a solid one. Middle management at a finance firm, decent salary, benefits, the respect of colleagues who thought I was dependable, steady, maybe even boring. And boring felt safe. Until I let myself believe I deserved more. It started with my best friend, Mark. He was the kind of man people described as magnetic, always talking about big opportunities, always making you feel like you were lucky just to be standing in his shadow. He'd been in my life since high school. I trusted him more than I trusted myself sometimes. So when he came to me with what he called a surefire investment, I didn't hesitate. "It's a tech startup," he said, leaning across my kitchen table late one night while my wife washed dishes in the background. "They've got the patents, the brains, and they just need funding. I'm putting in my money. You should too. In a year, we'll be sitting on millions." I can still remember the way his voice dripped with confidence, how the words millions echoed in my head. My wife shot me a look, half curious, half worried, but I brushed it off. Why would my best friend lie to me? So I signed the checks, not just from my savings, but from our retirement funds too. I even mortgaged the house again. Every last cent went into that opportunity. For a while, I let myself dream. I pictured paying off debts, taking vacations, finally giving my family the future I thought they deserved. But dreams, I learned, can turn into nightmares overnight. One morning, I woke up to dozens of messages, investors panicking, emails bouncing back, the company's website gone. The so-called tech startup had vanished, and so had Mark. At first, I refused to believe it. I called him over and over, left desperate voicemails, but within a week it was undeniable. He'd disappeared, along with every penny I had. That was the day the world I'd built crumbled. The fallout was brutal. Debt collectors came knocking almost immediately. My wife, already tired of my long hours and broken promises, finally had enough. She packed her bags, took the kids, and slammed the door behind her. "I told you not to trust him," she hissed through tears. "Now you've ruined everything." And maybe she was right. Work wasn't any kinder. My bosses heard whispers about the failed investment, about lawsuits circling, about my connection to fraud. In less than a month, I was let go. Restructuring, they called it. But I knew the truth. I was a liability. The friends I thought I had stopped answering my calls. People crossed the street to avoid me. My phone, once buzzing with invitations and meetings, went dead silent. And so I found myself alone. Broke, jobless, homeless. I remember the first night I slept outside. The cold sank into my bones in a way I'd never felt before. It wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a reminder that the world didn't care if I froze. I curled up on a park bench, staring at the blinking city lights, wondering how everything had collapsed so fast. I thought about my kids, about how they'd remember me, not as a provider or protector, but as the man who gambled away their future. The shame was suffocating. Day after day, I wandered. Soup kitchens, shelters, the occasional kindness of a stranger handing me a sandwich. Nights were the worst. The city seemed to close in on me, mocking me with glowing windows of families safe inside, while I tried to ignore the ache in my stomach. And yet, even as I sat in that darkness, a voice kept whispering, "End it. You've already lost everything. Why keep going?" One night I almost listened. I stood at the edge of a subway platform, the roar of an approaching train filling my ears. One step, that's all it would take. One step and all the pain, the humiliation, the loneliness would vanish. But something stopped me. A flicker of instinct, a memory of my daughter's laugh, the faintest thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. So I walked away, shaking, crying, empty. And that's when I ended up back at the park bench, the same one I'd collapsed on before. I sat there for hours, staring at the ground, wondering if fate had simply decided I wasn't meant to have a future. Little did I know, in that very place where I'd felt the most worthless, a stranger was about to speak 7 words that would change my life forever. If losing everything had felt like being pushed off a cliff, what came after was the brutal crash at the bottom. I thought rock bottom was waking up with an empty bank account, a foreclosed house, and a wife who wanted nothing more to do with me. But rock bottom, I learned, has layers. Every time I thought it couldn't get worse, the ground gave way again. At first, I tried to pretend I still had some control. I walked into banks in my tattered suit, asking for extensions, trying to explain. The bankers looked at me with rehearsed sympathy, then cold detachment. One even smirked when I begged. "Mr. Parker, you don't have collateral, you don't have income, you don't even have a home. There's nothing we can do." Those words cut deeper than any insult. Bill collectors were relentless. Letters piled up, final notice stamped across them in red. One afternoon, 2 men in dark suits pounded on the motel door I was barely affording with borrowed money. They said they represented interested parties who wanted repayment immediately. I tried to explain that I'd been swindled, that I was a victim too. But the taller one leaned in close and hissed, "Victim or not, you're the one left holding the bag. Pay up or you'll regret it." The way he said it made my blood run cold. That night, I didn't go back to the motel. I couldn't risk it. I packed my few belongings into a backpack and walked out into the city with no destination. By morning, I was just another man wandering with nowhere to go. Hunger became my constant companion. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I sold my watch, my briefcase, even the wedding ring my wife had left behind. But money evaporates fast when you have no income and no support. Soon, I was lining up outside soup kitchens with people I once ignored on my morning commute. It's humbling, the way society strips you of identity once you're down. People no longer saw me as a man with a past. I was just one of them, the nameless homeless. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others crossed the street, clutching their bags tighter as if poverty were contagious. Nights on the street were the hardest. Every bench, every corner carried its own dangers. Drunks looking for fights, thieves preying on the vulnerable, and the cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making you question if you'll wake up the next morning. I remember one night when it rained nonstop. My clothes were soaked, my body shivering uncontrollably. I curled up under a half-broken bus stop shelter, watching the water flood the streets, and thought, maybe I should have jumped in front of that train after all. But then, just as I drifted into half-consciousness, I heard laughter. Not the joyful kind, the cruel kind. A group of teenagers had spotted me. One of them shouted, "Hey, look, Wall Street finally hit the pavement!" They pelted me with half-eaten food, plastic bottles, even coins. I tried to shield myself, but shame burned hotter than the sting of their attacks. When they finally left, I cried harder than I had in years. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity. I had none left. And still, the betrayals weren't over. I found out through whispers that Mark, the friend who had stolen everything, wasn't gone. He'd resurfaced in another state, living lavishly under a new company name. The investment he pitched me had been a scam from the start, carefully orchestrated to leave me as the fall guy. I was the name on the documents. The lawsuits, the debts, they were all attached to me. The realization hit like a second death. My friend hadn't just stolen my fortune. He had destroyed my reputation, ensuring I would carry the weight of his crime forever. That knowledge twisted inside me like a knife. Anger, shame, despair, they all battled for dominance. There were moments I plotted revenge, imagining what I'd do if I ever saw his face again. But those thoughts dissolved each time my stomach growled, or when I realized I didn't even have the bus fare to leave the city. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I sat on that familiar park bench again. My hands shook, not from the cold this time, but from rage and hunger colliding inside me. I whispered aloud, as if speaking to the universe, "Why me? What did I do to deserve this?" No answer came, only the rustling of leaves, the distant honk of traffic, the laughter of couples strolling by, oblivious to the man unraveling in the shadows. But as the hours stretched and darkness swallowed the park, I began to feel something shift inside me. It wasn't hope. No, I was far from hope. It was surrender. A bitter acceptance that this was my life now, that I'd never claw my way back, that I would die as nothing more than a nameless figure slumped on a bench. And maybe that's why, when footsteps approached from the darkness behind me, I didn't flinch. Maybe I even welcomed it, half hoping it was a mugger, someone to finally end this slow agony. But what I got wasn't a blow or a threat. It was something stranger, something I couldn't explain. A man shuffled into view. His clothes were rags, his beard wild, his smell sharp with the musk of streets. He was homeless, like me but older, harder, eyes burning with a clarity that startled me. He didn't ask for money. He didn't sneer or laugh. He just sat down beside me, close enough that I felt his shoulder brush mine. For a long moment he said nothing, and in that silence, I felt something unsettling, like he was measuring me, seeing through me. Finally, in a low, gravelly voice, he leaned toward me and whispered 7 words. "What you seek lies under the bench." I had been sitting on that park bench for hours, watching the world blur past me like a film I didn't belong in anymore. Children chased pigeons, joggers passed by with their headphones on, cars honked in the distance. None of it mattered. My world had collapsed into silence, into nothing. All I had left was a few coins in my pocket and the bitter taste of betrayal. As I sat there, slumped forward with my head in my hands, I felt the bench shift slightly. Someone had sat down beside me. At first, I didn't bother to look. People rarely sat next to me these days. Maybe they could feel the desperation radiating off me, but curiosity got the better of me, and I turned my head just enough to see him. He was an old man, clothes tattered, beard unkempt, and skin weathered by the streets. A homeless man. His eyes, however, were not what I expected. They were sharp, alert, too alive for someone who had clearly seen so much hardship. He didn't ask me for spare change. He didn't ramble or mumble nonsense. He simply stared at me as though he knew me, as though he could see the wreckage of my soul. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I was certain he would eventually hold out his hand, ask for food or money, like so many others did. But instead, he leaned slightly closer and whispered in a calm, deliberate voice, 7 words that sliced through the fog in my head. "Look under the bench at dawn." I froze. My heart gave a sudden, violent jolt. I lifted my head, blinking at him. "What?" I asked, my voice hoarse. But he didn't repeat himself. He simply leaned back as though satisfied he had said enough and stared off into the distance. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky, hollow. Look under the bench at dawn. What kind of nonsense was that? He had to be crazy. And yet those words burrowed into me, looping in my mind like a song I couldn't get rid of. "Why dawn? Why this bench?" I asked. But he didn't answer. He just looked at me with that same knowing expression, then slowly stood up. Before I could press further, he shuffled away, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the park. I sat there long after he left, staring at the ground, replaying his words over and over. It was absurd, completely absurd, and yet, a strange shiver of hope flickered deep inside me. I hadn't felt hope in weeks. By the time night fell, I was still there, clinging to those 7 words like a lifeline. I didn't dare leave. Something inside me told me I couldn't. So I waited. The hours dragged on, cold and restless. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again. "Look under the bench at dawn." Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I sat upright. My pulse quickened. This was it. Either I would find something, or nothing. Either way, I needed to know. The park was quiet, the world still half asleep. My hands trembled as I crouched down beside the bench, feeling along the underside with my fingers. For a moment, there was nothing but rough wood and cold metal. My stomach dropped. Had I really been foolish enough to believe the ramblings of a stranger? And then, my hand brushed against something solid. My breath caught. I reached further and pulled it out. A small package, wrapped in weathered plastic. My heart thundered in my chest as I tore it open. Inside was a yellowed envelope, edges brittle, sealed with tape that had long since lost its stick. Across the front, in faded ink, were symbols, strange markings, like shorthand or a code. I hesitated. My fingers shook as I peeled it open. Inside were several folded papers and, to my astonishment, a handwritten letter. The letter was brief, written in a hurried scrawl, but every word hit me like a hammer. If you are reading this, then I am gone. I leave this to the only one I can trust. You know who you are. These papers will prove your right to what is owed to you. Don't let them bury the truth. I stared at the words, my chest tightening. The handwriting, I recognized it instantly. It belonged to someone I had once known, someone who had disappeared years ago, my closest friend from college, Mark. He had been brilliant, ambitious, always chasing the next big deal. One day he was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. People said he vanished overseas, maybe even died. I never knew what became of him. And now here was his letter, addressed indirectly but unmistakably to me. My hands fumbled with the rest of the papers. They weren't random scraps. They were documents, stock certificates, contracts, legal filings. Old, yes, but still valid. My eyes widened as I realized what they represented. Mark had invested heavily in a company back then, a startup we both thought was doomed. But it hadn't failed. It had exploded, grown into one of the largest corporations in the country. These papers were worth more than I could fathom. I sat back on the bench, dazed. My mind reeled. How had these ended up hidden here under this very bench? And how, in God's name, had that homeless man known? I glanced around the park, half expecting to see him watching me from a distance, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I clutched the papers to my chest, my breath coming fast. This was real. This could change everything. But fear slithered in alongside the hope. Why had Mark left this for me? What danger had he been in? And most unsettling of all, had that old man been a coincidence? Or was I now caught in something far bigger, far darker than I could imagine? The dawn had broken fully now, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. People began filling the park again. Joggers, children, workers hurrying to start their day. But for me, time stood still. I had been penniless, broken, abandoned. And now, in my hands, I held the key to a fortune, and possibly the truth behind a mystery I hadn't even known I was a part of. But one question burned in my mind more fiercely than the rest. Where was that homeless man now, and why had he chosen me? The papers trembled in my hands, fragile as old leaves, yet heavy with a weight that felt almost unbearable. I had gone from nothing, from begging for scraps, from dodging debt collectors, from being spat on in the streets, to holding what could be a key to everything I had lost, and more. But the momentary rush of hope quickly tangled with fear. This wasn't just money. It was something far more dangerous. I scanned the documents again, eyes darting over the faded ink. Stock certificates in the name of Mark Ellison. Contracts with signatures I recognized from board members who had since become industry titans. Legal filings stamped with dates from more than a decade ago. These weren't worthless relics. They were proof. Proof that Mark had owned shares in what was now a corporate empire worth billions. And the letter. That short, frantic scrawl, "You know who you are. These papers will prove your right to what is owed to you. Don't let them bury the truth." My pulse thundered. Right to what is owed. What did he mean? That these shares were mine? That he had intended them for me all along? I shoved the bundle back into the plastic wrapping and hugged it against my chest, scanning the park nervously. People strolled past, oblivious, but paranoia gnawed at me. What if someone knew? What if someone had been watching the whole time? That was when I noticed him. A man in a dark coat, leaning casually against a lamppost at the edge of the park. He wasn't jogging, wasn't walking a dog, wasn't reading a paper like the others. He was just standing there, watching. The moment our eyes almost met, he turned away and lit a cigarette, as if he hadn't been staring at all. My stomach twisted. Was this coincidence? Or had I just stumbled into something much bigger than I understood? I shoved the papers deeper into my backpack and forced myself to stand. My legs shook, but I walked quickly, refusing to look back. Every instinct screamed at me to get away, to hide, to protect the treasure I'd just unearthed. By the time I reached the edge of the park, my shirt clung with sweat. I ducked into an alley and pressed my back to the wall, pulling in ragged breaths. My mind spun with questions, but one thought rang louder than the rest. The old man. How had he known? How could he possibly have known about something buried under that bench for over a decade? And where had he gone? I wanted to believe he was some kind of guardian angel, some mysterious messenger sent to pull me from the edge of despair. But another possibility gnawed at me. What if he wasn't an angel? What if he was baiting me, drawing me into a trap? I slid down the wall, clutching the bundle tighter, and opened the letter again. The handwriting was undeniably Mark's. I could see his loops and slants, the way he wrote his T's like crosses. My chest ached with memory, late nights at the dorm, scribbling business plans on napkins, dreaming of the empire we'd build together. But then came the bitterness. Mark had betrayed me once. Hadn't he? The scam, the missing millions, the lawsuits pinned to my name. It had all been his doing. And yet, here was evidence that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't abandoned me completely. Maybe he had left me this lifeline, unless it was another setup. The thought chilled me. If these papers were worth as much as I suspected, others would kill for them. Maybe Mark had died for them. Maybe I'd just inherited not a fortune but a target on my back. A sudden noise jolted me from my thoughts, footsteps echoing in the alley. I shoved the papers back into my pack and scrambled to my feet. A figure appeared at the far end. My heart lurched. It was the same man from the park, the one in the dark coat. He walked slowly, deliberately, his cigarette glowing in the dim light. His eyes locked on me, and this time he didn't bother pretending otherwise. I bolted. My legs pumped as I tore down the alley, my breath ragged, my backpack thumping against my shoulders. Behind me, I heard the man's footsteps quicken. I burst out onto a busy street, weaving between startled pedestrians. Horns blared as I darted across traffic, narrowly avoiding a taxi. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Finally, I ducked into a subway station, plunging down the stairs two at a time. The crowd swallowed me, and I shoved my way onto the first train that screeched into the platform. The doors closed just as I saw the man reach the bottom of the stairs, scanning the platform with cold eyes. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived, because I knew he wouldn't stop. Whoever he was, he wanted what I had, and I had no idea who else might be coming after me. As the train rattled into the tunnels, I clutched the backpack like a lifeline and forced myself to think. The papers were real, Mark's letter was real, but I needed more. I needed proof, protection, allies. And suddenly, an idea flickered. There was someone who might help. An old professor of ours, now a respected lawyer, who had always believed in me even when others doubted. If anyone could validate these documents and keep them safe, it was him. The train screeched to a halt, and I made my decision. I wouldn't run forever. Not again. I would find out the truth. But as I stepped onto the platform, I caught sight of something that froze me in place, a scrap of paper fluttering on the ground by the stairwell. I bent down and picked it up. Scrawled across it in the same hurried handwriting as Mark's letter were 4 chilling words. They know. Trust no one. My blood turned to ice. The dawn had brought me hope, but with it came something darker, an unseen enemy, circling closer with every step I took. And for the first time, I realized, finding the papers hadn't saved me. It had marked the beginning of a war I wasn't ready for. The documents felt heavier with every step I took, as if they carried not just wealth, but the weight of secrets buried for years. I couldn't stop replaying the letter in my mind. Mark's rushed scrawl, the warning not to let them bury the truth. Whoever they were, I had no doubt they hadn't disappeared along with him. And now, by stumbling into this strange inheritance, I had painted a target on my own back. I didn't go home right away. Home no longer felt safe. Instead, I ducked into a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid for coffee. I slid into a corner booth and spread the documents in front of me, trying to make sense of them. Contracts, share certificates, Transfer records, legitimate, all of them. But one name kept jumping out: Harrington Industries. The company had started as a small tech venture during our college years. Everyone laughed at it. Even I doubted Mark when he poured his savings into it. But now, Harrington Industries wasn't just successful, it was everywhere. Defense contracts, medical technology, real estate, a quiet empire worth billions. And somehow, Mark's holdings, or what was left of them, were sitting in my hands. My coffee had long gone cold when I felt it, that prickle at the back of my neck. The same one I used to get when walking alone at night and realizing someone was behind me. I glanced at the window's reflection. A man sat 2 booths away, pretending to read a newspaper. Too neat, too still. He hadn't touched his drink. I gathered the papers quickly, shoving them back into the plastic wrapping. My pulse hammered in my throat. Paranoia? Maybe? But Mark's letter had warned me, and the timing was too perfect. I tossed a few bills on the table and headed for the door. The night air was cool against my face as I stepped outside, but I didn't slow down. I walked fast, then faster, weaving through side streets, checking every shadow. And still, that prickle followed. Whoever he was good. He never got too close, but I felt him there, matching my pace. Finally, I ducked into an alley and pressed my back to the wall, clutching the package tight. My breath came in sharp bursts. A silhouette appeared at the mouth of the alley, tall, broad-shouldered. He didn't move closer, just stood there, framed by the glow of the streetlight. "You shouldn't have taken it," he called out, his voice low, steady. I froze. The package burned in my arms. "Taken what?" I shouted back, trying to buy time, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The papers," he said. "They don't belong to you. Hand them over and no one gets hurt." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. No one gets hurt, as if I could believe that. My mind spun. Fight, run, negotiate. But before I could decide, a sound cut through the tension. The scrape of shoes against pavement. Another figure emerged from the shadows of the alley. Smaller, older. The homeless man. The same one from the park. He stepped between me and the stranger, his posture calm but unyielding. "He's not yours to take," the old man said, his voice carrying an authority that made the hairs on my arms rise. The tall man stiffened, then cursed under his breath. For a moment I thought he might lunge forward. Instead, he turned sharply and disappeared back into the night, swallowed by the city as quickly as he had come. I stared at the old man, stunned. "Who are you?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head toward the end of the alley. "Not here. Too many ears." My legs moved before my brain caught up, following him through a maze of streets until we reached an abandoned church on the outskirts of downtown. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and silence. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor. The man sat down on one, motioning for me to join him. "You don't understand what you're holding," he said finally, nodding to the package clutched in my arms. "Those papers aren't just proof of ownership. They're leverage. Dangerous leverage." I swallowed hard. "And you knew they were under the bench. You led me to them." His eyes, sharp even beneath the grime of the streets, locked on mine. "I promised Mark I would. He left them there for you, but he made me swear to wait until you were ready." My head spun. "Ready for what?" "To finish what he started," the man replied simply. "To take back what was stolen." I wanted to press him, demand answers, but the weight of his words left me reeling. Mark had trusted him. Mark had planned this. And somehow, even after all these years, his shadow stretched into my ruined life, offering me a path forward or a noose around my neck. The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They will come again. Stronger, more desperate. You have to decide. Will you hide or will you fight?" I stared at the faded papers in my hands, then back at him. My chest rose and fell with the enormity of it all. For the first time since losing everything, I realized I had a choice, and that choice would change everything. The package had become both my anchor and my curse. Each night I slept with it pressed against my chest, terrified that if I loosened my grip, it would vanish like everything else in my life. Every page inside whispered of power, of leverage, of a chance to claw my way back from the gutter, but it also screamed danger. 2 nights after I found it, I realized I was being followed. At first, I thought it was paranoia born from hunger and sleeplessness. But when I cut through an alley and saw the same black sedan crawl past the exit, headlights off, I knew. Someone else knew about the papers. I moved quickly after that. I found a dingy public library where no one bothered me, and under the fluorescent hum of dying light bulbs, I studied the documents until my eyes burned. The more I read, the clearer it became. Mark hadn't just run a scam. He had buried secrets, massive ones, inside corporate filings and shell companies. These papers were the skeleton key to exposing him. But how? I was nobody now, a homeless man who smelled like sweat and despair. If I walked into a law office or a newsroom, they'd throw me out before I got past the front desk. That night, as I hunched over the letter again, one line leapt out at me. Don't let them bury the truth. Them. Mark hadn't worked alone. The debts, the false signatures, the bogus accounts, they were tied to bigger names. Companies I recognized from the financial pages back when I still wore suits and carried briefcases. This wasn't just about one man's betrayal. It was a conspiracy. The realization both terrified and electrified me. If I could prove it, if I could force the truth into the light, maybe I wouldn't just save myself. I'd bring down the people who had destroyed me. But the clock was ticking. That car kept reappearing. One evening, as I left the library, 2 men cornered me on the sidewalk. I recognized one of them, the same tall man who had come to my motel door weeks earlier. Give us what you've got, he growled. My body froze. I tightened my grip on the backpack. I don't know what you're talking about, I muttered, though my voice shook. The other man stepped closer, eyes cold. Don't play stupid. You won't survive another week out here if you keep this up. For a second, I thought it was over. I pictured them dragging me into the alley, ending me right there. But then, headlights swept across the street as a bus pulled up to the curb. A few passengers stepped off, breaking the tension just enough. I bolted. Heart pounding, lungs on fire, I sprinted 3 blocks before ducking into the shadows of an all-night diner. I knew then that waiting wasn't an option. If I didn't act, they'd take everything. Again. The next morning, I made my choice. I headed to the only place where the truth couldn't be silenced, the press. But not the big glossy outlets. They were too deep in corporate pockets. Instead, I found a small investigative journalist I remembered from years ago. She had once written about corruption in the financial sector, exposing fraud no one else dared to touch. Her office was nothing more than a cramped room above a laundromat. When I showed up at her door, she eyed me with suspicion. We don't give out spare change here, she said flatly. I don't need change, I rasped. I need someone who still believes in truth. Something in my tone must have stopped her from shutting the door. I pulled out the envelope, careful not to reveal everything at once. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first few pages. Then she motioned me inside. For hours, we sat at her battered desk while I poured out everything: the scam, the debts, the threats, the betrayal. She asked sharp, relentless questions, testing every detail. And finally, she leaned back, her face pale. This could topple giants, she whispered. My chest tightened. But will you run it? She hesitated. If I do, you'll have a target the size of Manhattan on your back. They won't just come for me, they'll come for you. They already are, I said simply. The following week blurred into a storm. She and her small team verified every scrap of evidence, connecting dots I hadn't even seen. The documents were authentic. The signatures matched. The trail led not just to Mark, but to CEOs, board members, even a senator whose campaign had been funded with laundered money. The night before publication, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the streets, clutching my backpack, though it was now mostly empty. Fear gnawed at me. What if they silenced her? What if the story never saw the light of day? And then, just as despair threatened to crush me again, I saw him, the old homeless man, the one who had first whispered those 7 words. He was sitting across the street, hunched on a stoop, watching me. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting second I thought he might come over. But he didn't. He just nodded once, a small, knowing gesture, then melted back into the shadows. The next morning, the story broke. Headlines screamed across the nation. Corporate conspiracy exposed. Billion-dollar fraud uncovered. Mark's name was splashed on every screen, his face alongside charts of shell companies and money trails. The senator resigned within hours. CEOs denied involvement, but subpoenas were already flying. And me? For the first time in months, I wasn't invisible. Reporters crowded outside the laundromat office, shouting questions. Some called me a whistleblower. Others called me a fraud. But no one could ignore me. Still, victory tasted strange. I wasn't free yet. The debts hadn't vanished. The threats hadn't stopped. And somewhere out there, Mark was still moving, still plotting. But as I stood in that tiny newsroom, surrounded by flashing cameras and furious phone calls, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. I felt alive, and I knew this was only the beginning. I never imagined that a single whispered sentence from a ragged old man could bring me here, to a place where my life was no longer defined by loss, but by purpose. The storm that had once consumed me had finally passed, and in its wake, I was left with something greater than wealth. I was left with clarity. In the months following the discovery under the park bench, my life transformed in ways I could barely comprehend. The documents Mark had hidden were not only real, but powerful enough to shatter the lies that had entangled my past. Lawyers confirmed everything, piece by piece. I wasn't just holding scraps of paper. I was holding the blueprint to reclaiming everything that had been stolen from me, and more. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on my chest began to lift. Yet, with that relief came a heavier responsibility. What was I going to do with this second chance? The money, when it came, felt unreal. Numbers in bank accounts, assets transferred, stock dividends that ballooned overnight. It was wealth beyond anything I had ever touched before. But strangely, it wasn't the riches themselves that shook me most. It was the faces of the people I passed in the streets, the struggling single mother carrying groceries heavier than her frame, the veteran sleeping under a bridge, the teenager with hollow eyes trying to sell his guitar for scraps of cash. Each one of them reminded me of myself on that bench, the version of me who had nothing but despair and who had been saved by a stranger's 7 words. I couldn't shake the thought. If I had been given a miracle, wasn't I meant to pass it on? I began quietly funding shelters, slipping donations into charities that worked where the government failed, handing envelopes of cash to families I'd never meet again. At first, it was anonymous, but as time passed, people began to notice. Reporters called it philanthropy. I called it survival, because without giving back, the wealth felt like poison in my hands. Still, one question haunted me. The old man. Who was he? Why me? I searched for him relentlessly. I went back to that park day after day, asking around, describing him to anyone who would listen. Some shook their heads, others claimed they might have seen him once or twice, but no one knew his name. It was as if he had appeared only for me, spoken those words, and vanished. A ghost in rags. Then, one night, months after my life had turned around, I dreamed of him. In the dream, he sat beside me again on the same bench. He didn't look ragged or weary anymore. His clothes were clean, his beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes brighter than ever. He leaned close, just as he had that night, and whispered something new. Don't waste the gift you've been given. I woke up gasping, heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. It felt so real, as though he had returned one last time to remind me of what mattered. I knew, in that moment, that whether he was flesh and blood or something beyond, he had chosen me for a reason, and I couldn't let him down. Years passed, and the story of the man who lost everything only to rise again spread farther than I expected. My name appeared in magazines, interviews, even television features. They called me a survivor, a success story, a symbol of resilience. But I never let them forget the truth, that none of it began with me. It began with a homeless man who saw me at my lowest and gave me a direction when I had none. When they asked about my secret, I would tell them honestly, 7 words saved my life. But the legacy I built wasn't in the headlines. It was in the shelters I opened, the scholarships I funded, the countless lives that quietly shifted course because someone believed in them when the world had not. And every time I walked into one of those places, I thought of him. I thought of how he'd seen me, not as a failure, but as someone still worth saving. That was the real gift he had given me. Not just the words, not just the hidden package, but the reminder that no one is truly invisible. On the anniversary of that night, I returned to the park bench. The city had changed around it, new buildings, new lights, but the bench was still there, weathered but unbroken, just like me. I sat down, closed my eyes, and listened to the sounds of life moving all around. Laughter, footsteps, the rustle of leaves in the wind. For a moment, I felt him beside me again, silent but steady. I whispered into the empty air, "Thank you. I won't forget." And I never did. The truth is, my story isn't about riches reclaimed or fortunes found. It's about how a single act of kindness, a single thread of faith, can reroute a destiny. I had been ready to give up. I had been ready to vanish. But those 7 words kept me alive long enough to discover the path that was waiting. If you're hearing this, maybe you're sitting on your own kind of bench, staring at your own kind of darkness. If you are, hold on. Because hope has a way of finding us when we least expect it. Sometimes it comes dressed in rags, speaking in whispers. But it comes. I was left penniless, broken, and forgotten. Until a homeless man whispered 7 words that changed everything. And from that moment on, I vowed to live a life worthy of that miracle. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the darkest hour can become the beginning of everything.